for our community building, well, we do stuff like this. And so after this, we're going to head over to the Durham Food Hall and just share the space there and have a chance to break bread together. Also a chance to criticize Aaron for his presentation, challenge him on his beliefs, tell him that he's wrong about our moral realism. It's going to be a fun time. Or we're having, oh, the word shrunk, sorry. Or we're having a picnic tomorrow at the Dogwood Shelter of Lake Crabtree County Park. I went to the Costco yesterday. I got beef burgers, Impossible burgers, hot dogs. My wife went and picked up bratwursts. We have bread and toppings for those. So if you want a potluck, a side dish, or a dessert, or not, and just show up. And we're going to have a picnic and hang out. Another chance to harass Aaron before he leaves. And my daughter is a musician, and she'll be bringing her guitar. And another friend of ours is bringing, as of yet, an unidentified instrument. So if you play an acoustic instrument, please bring it and you can jam. It's always kind of fun. Only acoustic, though. The park doesn't allow microphones. And November is probably our last hike of the year. I imagine we're not going to do in December. We don't know. Depends on the weather. Depends on the weather. We'll see. Raven Rock State Park. It's going to be a double hike in the morning, bring your own lunch, hike in the afternoon, or show up for any of those 3 segments by themselves. More information on our website. Try and get brief about that word. See, I know the website. And dogs are welcome. Then we have regular meetups. So we have a Raleigh one, Durham one, Google Meet one that are happy hours. And then we have a weekly breakfast, like a lot of you were there this morning in Raleigh, and a monthly breakfast there in Durham. Again, all that's on our website, so check the website out. And it's in the newsletter to remind you. And it's on Meetup. Service. We have our last service event of the year planned to be volunteering at the North Carolina Food Bank, or the Eastern North Carolina Food Bank in Raleigh. We did Durham a month or 2 ago, so now we're going to do the Raleigh one. It's a wonderful time to break your back sorting vegetables for people in need. It's a fun time. We're limited to 20 volunteers, so QR code or go to the website for the link to go register and get one of those slots, because they don't want us to swoop in last minute with 100 people. They don't have capacity for that. Well, education, the important one. So we brought in a professor to be a lecturer from Rutgers to talk to us about the just world delusion. This is my good friend, Aaron Rabinowitz. He is now a third-time TFS speaker, tying Andrew Seidel, and Andrew already said he wants to come back because he doesn't like the idea that you're going to beat him. We have to get a smoking jacket or something for the 5-time speakers. That's going to be cool. So he's getting his PhD, and so he can continue to send students to therapy by telling them that everything that you accomplish in life is due to luck all the way down. I'm sure that'll come up in today's presentation. He hosts 2 philosophy podcasts, Embrace the Void, which I was a guest on. Alex was a guest on, so I don't know what the rest of you are waiting for. Do something awesome, be a guest on Embrace the Void to talk about politics, social justice, and philosophy. And he co-hosts Philosophers in Space with former TFS speaker Callie Wright, where they discuss philosophy through different science fiction books, short stories, TV shows, movies, and lots of Star Trek since Callie joined the team. And also you can find Aaron's writings on skeptic.co.uk, which is the UK Skeptic magazine, and it's he breaks down lots of really, really in-depth articles. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Aaron and let him just give us 30 seconds for a switch of presentation. Aaron Rabinowitz.
Okay, can you all hear me all right? Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out for this. I really appreciate it. This is a particularly meaningful talk for me for a couple of reasons. Many hundreds of years ago in the before times, I gave my first ever public philosophy talk for Triangle Free Thought, where I talked about my dissertation topic for my master's program out in Colorado about moral realism and why you shouldn't abandon the idea of objective morality when you abandon the idea of God. As Matt said, I'm always happy to discuss that more, often over pizza. But this time I'm back talking about something that I wasn't really studying at this point, when I was here those many years ago, but is now at the center of work that I'm doing related to the luck-pulling stuff, which is this idea of the just world delusion, or some will call it the just world theory, hypothesis, belief, lots of different names get thrown around for this. But I kind of think that this might be the big bad at the heart of a lot of our social problems. And so I want to talk about why the desire to see us living in a just world is kind of the cause and solution to all of life's problems. For folks who are not familiar with 6 Feet Under, one of the best shows ever made on HBO, this particular moment, I think, pretty thoroughly encapsulates the problem of just world belief. If you quite understandably hope that, like, acting ethically is going to result in good outcomes for you, then you're going to probably be disappointed in this world sometimes. So, just world delusion. Why does this matter? Let's talk about, I'm just going to briefly lay out the goals of the talk here. I'm trying to get better at signposting ahead of time where this absurdity is going to go. First of all, I just want to help y'all understand a little bit the psychology of just world beliefs. Now, I am by nature and training a philosopher, but I was raised by a psychologist, and so have stolen all of their secrets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and its relation to things like moral psychology. I want you to understand in particular the harmful impacts of just world belief on behavior and other kinds of beliefs. I want you to also, hopefully, come away understanding how we can attack this problem best by talking about luck, which, as Matt previewed, is the thing that I have been obsessed with since I came here even. I've been obsessed with luck for about 10 years now, I guess 15 maybe. My poor father's had to hear ever so much about it. And it took me about 10 years to have anything worthwhile to say on it. And hopefully after another 4 or 5, I will have a book that everyone can read and I can stop talking about it forever. This time though, we're going to be talking about a different person's life's work, which is a guy named Melvin Lerner. He was the first person to propose the idea of the just world hypothesis, as he called it, back in the 80s. It has since then garnered a great deal of attention. 70s and 80s, I should say. I think it was almost back to 68 even. So what is the just world hypothesis? Well, very basically, it is the need, the psychological need, to believe that people mostly get what they deserve. I'm curious, show of hands, obviously with that setup, probably not many, how many of you would say you agree with this idea that people mostly get what they deserve in this world? All right, let the record show 0 hands, which is smart of you, right? That would have gone poorly for you otherwise. But I'm going to help you understand why this is still something you should be concerned about, even though none of you raised your hands. These are a couple quotes from Lerner that I think help really clarify why this matters for people not in this room. The just world hypothesis or belief is one of, if not the way, that people come to terms with or make sense out of or find meaning in their experiences. So this is in a domain of psychology called attribution theory, which I spent a lot of time studying recently. Very simply, as you go through your day-to-day life, you experience things, hopefully. If you do, you then ascribe those things to stuff. That was because I made a mistake. That was just total bad luck, right? Attributions like that happen constantly throughout your day. They cut me off because they're an asshole, that kind of thing, right? And how you attribute things impacts your future behavior, right? I did poorly on that test because I'm very bad at philosophy and should probably quit philosophy forever, versus I did poorly on that test because I didn't study at all last night and I should maybe study more next time. Lerner goes on to say, and again, this may not feel like it applies to you, we do not believe that things just happen in our world. There is a pattern of events which conveys not only a sense of orderliness or predictability, but also the compelling experience of appropriateness, expressed in the typically implicit judgment, yes, that is the way it should be. Now, maybe no one in this room feels like they ever have any of these thoughts as they're going through their lives, but I will warn you, like many implicit biases, you may still be acting on these beliefs even if you're not aware of them. I would say the just world hypothesis is truly the mother of all copes. It is the ultimate way in which our minds protect ourselves from being really, really sad. And this makes things complicated because while I think this is the cause of all of our lives' problems, removing it may also potentially cause issues. So we have to understand the complexities of this to make sure that we're not causing more harm as we shift people's understanding. So first of all, I want to make a little note. Just world belief is a little bit of a misnomer in that A, it's not absolute confidence, it's, like I said, mostly just, but also there are different kinds of just world belief they've discovered. So it was originally viewed as a sort of unitary concept, and then like everything in psychology, it gets hacked into smaller and smaller sub-concepts. The main ones I want you to be aware of, at least here, is personal versus general just world belief. So personal would be, the world is just mostly for me. Right? So if you feel like you've experienced justice throughout your life, maybe you're more likely to believe this, or maybe not. They're not actually sure if experience impacts this or not. In contrast, we have the generalized just world belief. Right? The world is mostly just for everybody. Both of these probably arise from a mix of psychological factors, and is often the case in psychology. It's very hard to disentangle similar looking things and also figure out exactly what's causing them. But some theories would include things like, first of all, just our innate sense of fairness, right? If you're not familiar, there are interesting studies that show that young infants as early as 6 months old will punish people who they think are acting unfairly or will act negatively towards individuals who they think have done something wrong. And I think this is reasonable evidence that amongst our innate evolved features as a pro-social species is a kind of hardwired sense of fairness. Other things I should mention, as I said, some people think that this would not naturally arise as a result of your experiences of justice or injustice. And while there may sometimes be connections there, because this is the kind of illusion where your mind has a bunch of tricks for protecting itself from information and experiences, there may not actually be that strong a correlation between your real experiences and what you believe about this subject. Other factors would be things like the need for order and meaning. This one is probably pretty significant here. The basic idea being, I'll sort of unpack this more in a second, you want to feel like things are going to go well if you do the right thing. And the less you feel that, the harder it is to do anything, is the concern. It appears from the research, and again, this is heavily contested stuff, generalized just world belief is probably more of a problem than personalized just world belief, but there probably are issues with both of them, and they likely, to some extent, connect together, but definitely we want to see, in my opinion, a precipitous drop in generalized just world belief if I've convinced you of all of this by the end of this conversation. Now, what are the positive effects? So just world belief is sometimes referred to as a positive illusion. Similar positive illusions are things like belief in free will or the illusion of control, and it is actually directly connected to the illusion of control. They're called positive illusions because they appear to have some positive effects. That doesn't necessarily, I think, mean you should actually want to believe in them, but some people do. And there are people, for example, who will argue with me about how we should disabuse everyone of the belief in free will. A guy like Smolansky has a book where he says, Aaron's right, there is no free will, but let's lie to the children about it, because otherwise things will go badly. That is literally his argument. So what are the possible benefits of this particular positive delusion? As I said, the universe appears ordered and predictable, which in turn, hopefully, leads to things like a sense of security, the illusion of control, this feeling that you have your handle on things and can manage everything, increased self-efficacy. So as a result of thinking you're in control, paradoxically, you sometimes actually are more in control. Your mind makes it happen a little bit, right? So if you think you're in control, you will sometimes work a little harder or push a little harder or think you can do something that you wouldn't have thought you could do otherwise, and so take a chance and do it. So this is often what you see in things like education theory around motivation. There's a lot of positive illusions running around that are mostly aimed at helping students, especially from marginalized backgrounds, to have the kind of resilience and willingness to keep going that might help them improve their station in life. Unfortunately, it comes at the cost of a lot of bad information and also often turning them into workaholics because they have to feel like they have to work as hard as possible, and if they don't, that is going to be the only reason that they failed. Other effects, high expectations of life. You're more likely to think things are going to go well for you if you think you're a good person and you think it's a just world. Positive attitudes about the future, similarly. And all of this, in theory, leads to more voluntary struggles for an ideal life. So you are willing to push harder for your life to be better as a result. And maybe even act more ethically in some ways. So there's some evidence. One study, for example, asked students to do something ethical, help another student right before a test. And what they found was there was some correlation between people who helped the student and people who believed in a just world because they thought they'd be rewarded for that good behavior. So it is that basic principle that the universe is going to be looking out for me and rewarding me if I do the right thing. All of this can kind of be summed up in this idea, similar to like things we see in the secular world, this kind of power of positive thinking, right? If you truly believe hard enough that it's a just world, you'll help bring it about in that kind of way. And the defendants of this view would want to argue in those kinds of ways. My stick got a little lazy. All right. So the dark side of avoiding cognitive dissonance. That's being weird. Okay. When people lack the ability to make the world just, they will, unfortunately, resort to rationalizations and harmful behaviors to maintain that belief. Now, there's a lot of talk about the irrationality of humans these days, the immorality of humans. I will tell you, there is good evidence that most humans, given the choice, will first try to make the world actually just. They will try to compensate a victim if they can. They will try to remove an injustice if they can. But if they can't, they will fall back on things that are much, much worse, like conservatism. So one of the strongest correlates of just world belief is conservatism. And you can understand why, right? If you think the universe is just, you probably don't want to change it, right? Change might lead to an unjust world, and most conservatives would argue that our current world is fallen because we've abandoned various kinds of conservative ideals. We've made our world unjust in this kind of way. So conservatism, adherence to the status quo, all of that stuff is tightly connected to this just world belief. And this is why I start to think that like this is like the hidden big bad in all of the problems that we're dealing with. You can imagine what else is going to be on this list, right? Religiosity and other forms of magical thinking. So especially if your religion is one, like most Christianities, where, it's a just world and, God rewards the just in some way, then that is going to further reinforce this and provide protection against threats to your just world experiences. It's one of the ultimate protections, right? Related to this, we have this power of positive thinking. So even if you're not religious, the next thing that often runs a lot of people astray is going to be things like medical woo, right? Different kinds of pseudoscience. All of those things also rely on the illusion of control. They're also driven by the idea that if you do the right thing in the right kinds of ways, the world will reward you as such. They are also, as a result, also a bunch of victim blaming. So whether it's The Secret, The Wish, all these kinds of powers of positive thinking ideas. And part of that is because a lot of what we think of as modern evangelical Christianity and modern secular woo come out of the same movement, which is called the New Thought movement of the early 1900s, which is where you first see this idea where people are looking at the mind-body connection and thinking, oh, well, if I have the right thoughts, then I will have the right, whatever. Other weird correlations you find here, going way, way back in history, just world belief is correlated with things like preferring attractive individuals. So if you're familiar with classic Roman history, the Romans believed that if you were a good or bad person, you could tell by your appearance. If you were very attractive, that was proof you were a good person. And if you were disabled, that was proof that you had a broken soul. And that carries forward into the just world studies. So for example, there's a study where they create an unjust scenario, in a sense, or this is a study where they give money to a random person, and they tell them it's random, and then they ask them if it seems fair, essentially. And what they find is, if the person's more attractive, they decide it's more fair. And if the person's less attractive, they blame the whole group. So there's a lot of weird stuff running around in our brains, and a lot of it is just pattern matching, right? You're just trying to look at the universe and get information that will make you feel safer, more comfortable. And again, as I say, this all comes together in forms of cosmic victim blaming, right? Whether it's, you didn't pray hard enough, you didn't will it hard enough, you didn't think that it could happen enough. If it doesn't happen, you're to blame. And we're going to talk a bunch about victim blaming because one of the reasons just world belief has gotten so much attention is as an explanation for the behavior of victim blaming itself. But the sort of worst version of this, in my mind, at least personally from my experience, is things like God's divine plan. So many years ago, I was in a hospital room because a partner was very sick, and we had a revolving door of people coming to check on this person, and multiple people needed to tell me that the reason that they were sick was for some purpose, and God's divine plan was going to, bear that out in time. And I was not raised religious. I didn't have a deconversion story like lots of folks, so I was not really an angry atheist right up until about then. And then I was like, fuck God, I will fight God if that is true, because that is a terrible plan. But you can understand exactly where that comes from, especially in her case, because what you'll find is, if you can't derogate the victim, the next thing you're going to do is come up with some broader theory about how this really has a purpose or a reason or fits in some way, if not in this world, then in the next. And think about it, right? What is the biggest problem for God's divine plan? It's the existence of evil in the world, the problem of evil, as it were. And the number one answer, if you push people hard enough on this, for why there is evil in this world is because there is free will. Right? Because humans need to have free will because God wants us to. And for that to happen, we have to have the potential for suffering, to do the wrong thing, and all that stuff. And really interestingly, one of my favorite studies about free will, we used to assume that belief in free will led to an increased desire to punish. Makes sense intuitively, right? If you think someone is truly responsible for their actions, your desire to punish them goes up. What they found is there's pretty good evidence that the causal direction is opposite. That belief in free will is a rationalization that happens after the desire to punish. You start with a strong desire to see someone punished and suffering, and you rationalize doing it to them by telling yourself that they are free. So, belief in free will is one of the various subcopes that allows us to cope with the fact that we are very much not living in a just world. And then finally, and this one might rankle folks in here a little bit more, you're probably all with me right up until this moment, meritocracy, belief in meritocracy and the need for meritocracy is itself a substantial part of this. Now let me be clear, by meritocracy, there's a kind of Mont and Bailey that happens around this term, which is to say, there's the one people mean when they're talking to non-philosophers, which is that people get what they deserve in our society. If you have merit, you will be rewarded for having that merit. So if you work hard, you will get that job, right? In contrast with prior systems of nepotism, where you just inherited the job by birth or something. But meritocracy is bad. Because, so I should also say, people, once it's challenged, once we challenge that part of things, they will fall back on the idea of meritocracy is just, you want the best doctor to do the thing kind of view, not acknowledging that our system of meritocracy, and really any system of meritocracy, actually doesn't necessarily produce the best doctor gets to do the thing. Because meritocracies are systems more for reinforcing our belief that we deserve what we got than necessarily actually producing better outcomes for everybody involved. They are rationalization frameworks that lead to the idea that people actually think that folks like Elon Musk deserve their money, right? Or Bill Gates, if you prefer to not reference Elon, right? Bill Gates doesn't think he deserves his money. Bill Gates will talk about all the luck that he experienced that led to him having that success, but everybody else will believe this because otherwise it's a deeply, profoundly unjust world when one person has all of that money and doesn't deserve it. So a little bit more of these just world studies, and this is where I want you to be nervous about your own minds. We all like to think that we know our own minds, but if you're going to be skeptical, the first thing you have to be skeptical about is your own ability to introspect. That doesn't mean you're all irrational, and you're all lying to yourself all the time, but it does mean that you can easily walk yourself into believing things that you don't necessarily want to, or not be aware that you are still acting on certain biases without, consciously bringing them to the surface. So these are a bunch of victim blaming and degradation experiments. Situations where they see try to figure out why people will do things like blame a victim for their experiences, and this is slightly different. One thing is blaming a victim for their experiences, another is making that victim seem like a worse person because they deserve those, right? So you're probably familiar with they wore the red dress, and often these are involving sexual assault cases, right? So they were out at night wearing a red dress. You're not saying they're a bad person, you're saying they are incautious, they made a bad choice. And the reason is, you can then tell yourself, if I don't wear that dress in that place, that won't happen to me, right? Now let me ask you a question. Imagine a hypothetical, or two hypotheticals, right? Two individuals are sexually assaulted. One of them is a virgin and the other is a divorcee, okay? Which would you imagine, from what we've said here, is going to face more victim degradation or more, blaming of the victim in these scenarios? How many think it would be the virgin who's going to receive the most blame in these situations? How many think it's going to be the divorcee? Anyone want to say why? Because they're more sexually active already, right? They're putting themselves in those situations, maybe. It's the exact opposite. The virgin gets degraded more than the divorcee because the key factor is how much the person actually suffers relative to how much they appear to deserve to suffer. So it's not as much of a hit to your just world belief to hear that a divorcee got assaulted as it is to hear that an innocent young virgin got assaulted. And the only way your mind can cope with that in that situation is to think, maybe she wasn't so good after all, or maybe she acted in some way that was foolish, or they find if there's really no way to degrade the victim, so if it's a war buddy or something like that, you will just fall back on either just error of some sort or that grander purpose, right? This happened for a reason that isn't clear to us yet. There's always another level of protection, another level of hope, right? So if we can't close the gap by actually lowering the suffering of the individual, we will do it by degrading the victim to the point where they appear to deserve what happened. Now, most of us think that's bad, right? Victim blaming, bad. So that's a huge problem if that's the way that our mind copes. And think about how it plays out not just in sexual assault. Think about how people think that people deserve to be poor and tell themselves that poverty is a choice and they just didn't work hard enough, right? This is not actually just conservative, so it leans more conservative. What they find is the greater the undeserved, uncompensated suffering, the greater the victim blaming or degradation, all right? Now, it's not. Sorry, click is not playing friendly. Okay, now, most of this has been about people who aren't you in your minds, right? So now we're going to talk about why the rest of us aren't off the hook here. First of all, right, I get you want to say that's not me, but human psychology doesn't work that way. Just because you want the world to be just but don't think it is, doesn't mean that your brain still won't protect itself from really extreme evidence to the contrary. Because your mind wants to protect itself from things like depression, anxiety, fatalism about things like the environment. So what you end up with are still these kind of cognitive biases, one of my favorites being the fundamental attribution error. You know what the fundamental attribution error is? Kind of mouthful. This is the fancy name for the when I cut you off in traffic, it's because I'm late and I have a very good reason. And when you cut me off in traffic, it's because you're an asshole. It's where we attribute the cause, right? Whether it's an external, understandable cause or an internal cause due to the nature of you being a bad person. This is ubiquitous. This is one of probably the most reproduced things in all of human psychology, and everybody does it. All of us. And the best we can do is not completely weed it out. The best we can do is not weed it out, is just practice doing it less. And that's where I think luck comes in. The easiest way to do that is just recognize that nobody is ever bad in that sense and responsible and deserves to be punished. That even people who make poor choices are doing it because of bad luck. But we'll get there in a sec. Other ways in which I think I see this play out in the progressive left of center side of the world is going to be in things like retributive wokeness, by which I mean aggressive advocacy for social justice that also specifically looks to see people who are privileged suffer. And I think this is unfortunately way more widespread than we'd like to acknowledge, especially because in theory this kind of woke social justice orientation should move us pretty far away from that retributive model. Think about, most of you are probably for criminal justice reform, for example. You probably think that people in prisons are sick and don't deserve necessarily to suffer. They just need to be helped to not do that again and or prevented from being around people who they might harm. A kind of quarantine view. But we don't then successfully broaden that out and apply it to everybody. The way I would put this is, we have a systemic analysis of harm or of bad behavior, right? How many of you think crime is largely the result of poverty, right? But then we don't apply that consistently everywhere. We switch back to a kind of individualist analysis. And if you don't believe me, think back a few weeks to when the submarine went down, right? I shared some of those memes. Everybody did. It's coping. It is 100% cope, right? And look, I'm not gonna be a Puritan about this. Psychology is painful, life is painful, everybody has to cope a little bit sometimes. But be aware that this is a cope, that you are telling yourself these people deserved a horrible death because they had that money, including the kid who was on there. That's not reasonable, right? But it makes us feel better, right? It makes it feel like this actually is a slightly more just world because that happened. So this is endemic on all sides of the political spectrum. Just because it's worse on the right doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do in our own house if we're going to continue to promote a genuinely social justice-oriented agenda. We need to acknowledge that, we do sometimes go above and beyond what's necessary to address social justice issues to the point of demonizing people who I would argue are just victims of bad moral luck. Elon is just a victim of some very, very bad moral luck. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of it. We should just take Twitter away from him. Yeah. Another really interesting study is about the ways in which white privilege discourse done improperly turns liberals into conservatives with regard to poor white people. So this is a study where conservatives will generally tend to blame the victims of poverty for their situation. Liberals will tend not to, unless you teach them about wokeness the wrong way, in which case, when you tell them that someone is poor and white, they will do the same thing that conservatives do. They will believe that the person didn't take advantage of their privilege correctly or something, and so it's their own fault in this way, and they will be less sympathetic as a result. And that's a huge problem, because no one deserves to suffer from poverty, not even poor white people. So it is unfortunately easy to sort of slip back into some versions of this kind of just world thinking, even if you walked away from religion and the cosmic victim blaming stuff. On the ground level, there's still a lot of room to kind of quietly feel good that certain people are suffering. And again, back to our friend Meritocracy, right? lots of people on the left are still pro-meritocracy. It still seems like the best option to them, and I get it. It's better than the previous option, but it's not good for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's just aristocracy with better PR, all right? Even if you actually started everybody off evenly, one generation in, whoever succeeded the most is going to reproduce that success through their wealth. As long as merit can be purchased. I'm not even talking about, buying your kid a job. I'm talking about buying your kid tutors. I'm talking about getting your kid into the best school, making sure they don't have to work when they're going to school, so they can spend all of their time studying, building up their personal capital, so they can then go out and get themselves a really high-paying job, which you then see play out. I cannot recommend enough The Meritocracy Trap by Markovitz. He goes through all of this very beautifully. Another big feature of this is the way that wealthy people now compulsively work a lot more than they used to thereby do what we call conspicuous production. Elon saying he works 80 hours a week or whatever, as part of the arguments for how they also deserve their money, right? They're working so hard, they clearly deserve it. The problem is our students also do the exact same thing. So if you've been in school at any point recently, and it has maybe gotten slightly unsettled by the pandemic, we don't have good research on this yet, but certainly prior to the pandemic, the number one problem I saw as a teacher was burnout and workaholism. Because that's what our students were taught, is how they signal their merit. Because in attribution theory, what we took away from it is the thing you want to attribute your success to is how hard you work. Because that's what you have the most control over, not your innate ability, not the environment. So what we learned is tell everybody work as hard as you can and you will succeed. Nowadays, maybe we don't say it quite that strongly, but when I was growing up, it was really this view of like, if you work hard enough, you can literally do anything. And this plays out when you ask students, even students who understand how unjust our world is, what is the number one factor that leads to success? They will still say, by a large majority, hard work. And maybe that's because, again, they think they need to signal that to you, but it's also because I think they genuinely believe that, despite the overwhelming evidence that it's your parents' socioeconomic status that determines your outcomes. So, what do we do about all of these problems? This is where luck pilling comes in. So luck pilled, a term that I didn't fully coin, though I hope to popularize. The incel did me to it ever so slightly. But if you've heard the phrase red pilled, this is that, but for luck. It is awakening everyone to the taboo, and I do think it's genuinely taboo truth, that everything is luck all the way down. Everything about you, your experiences, your environment, everything you don't experience. The fact that you were not born in 1930s Germany. All of those things are luck, and they all contribute to your outcomes. And I think if you buy into this idea, it will force you to abandon belief in free will and belief in what we call desert entailing responsibility, the kind of responsibility by which we think that you deserve to be punished or rewarded. That is not the same as the causal responsibility that we use to assess what happened and how to fix it. You also have to get rid of things like meritocracy, because honestly the concept of desert makes no sense. I would recommend just getting rid of saying anyone deserves anything ever. And just replace it. This is a restorative justice. This is at the core of restorative justice thinking. They replace desert-based accounts with need-based accounts of justice and ethics. And it produces much better results once you get people weaned off this need for belief in just deserts. In theory, though I haven't gotten to test this yet, but I'm working on it, generalized just world belief should pretty much drop precipitously for the foreseeable future if you are luck-pilled, right? We are so far off from living in a just world that there's no chance in your lifetime that you should have strong belief in a just world if you truly accept this luck-pilled view. Personalized just world belief is a little more complicated. I think what should happen is it should become more accurately calibrated to how fairly you've actually been treated. Because right now, most of you are living on biases that might impact, in some degree, how just you think your experiences have been. You've told yourself that you deserve things, when you didn't. You still didn't deserve anything. But we all tell ourselves that we to some extent deserve the things that we have, And so what I think will happen is for a lot of people, personalized just world belief will go down. And there will be, some existential crises involved. This is true of all luck pilling. I talk in my other fully luck pill focused talks that potential psychological risks of this view, once you get past the objections, are things like fatalism and nihilism, so demotivation or belief that nothing matters. But I think you can come out of that pretty easily, actually. Because I don't think the reasons that you do things are because you're free and get to choose them in this kind of way. Think about when you do service work and you help people. Are you doing it maybe you are doing it just because you want the rewards, in which case we need to wean you off of external reward mechanisms and onto intrinsic valuing of things. But if you're lucky enough to have had your pleasure yoked to the ethical rules, to the good in this way, you are doing the right thing because it feels good. And you will still feel good when you realize that it was pure luck that it feels good to you. You will still want to do it. You still won't want to do bad things. I have, fingers crossed, not yet had a student who turned into a mass killer because, morality doesn't matter anymore because it's all luck. Because you're still hardwired as a pro-social creature to want to help people, to not want to hurt them. And honestly, paradoxically, on this view, you should become more secure in your self-efficacy because you stop blaming souls for what's happening and start looking at the actual causal factors in your mind and other people's minds for what's happening. If you're believing in free will, you are ultimately believing in magic, something inside of people that is separate and special, and that doesn't exist, and the more you try to fight that thing with retributive justice, the more you're just causing suffering. Whereas if you acknowledge the causes of criminal behavior in poverty, in lack of a meaning in life, in the feeling that you can't escape your status, then you can address those problems and thereby improve everybody's quality of life. So the first thing you have to do is stop believing in magical things, and then you can start addressing the real things that exist. Now, will students' test grades go down a little bit? Maybe. But that's good. That's fine. It doesn't matter. We've gotten them to obsess with the test grades to begin with. Right? Now, this is a particularly utopian thing that I'm suggesting in all of this. I've been accused of being deeply, deeply utopian by my friend who's a philosopher of utopian thought. It is. It's a multi-generational problem, and it needs multi-generational solutions. And the first thing you have to do is dig down deep to the psychological roots of all of the things that are screwing us up. Find good philosophical arguments and psychological practices that can help cut out those roots, and then you can actually bring about a change in society. But as long as people believe that we just need the meritocracy a little harder and everything will get fair, we're never going to radically change the system because they're still going to think that the wealthy deserve what they have and the poor deserve what they don't. So, stop trying to figure out who deserves what. Focus on needs-based approaches. And thereby correct your attribution errors. Here's a good practice. When somebody does something stupid in traffic, actively remind yourself that they are probably in crisis, or if nothing else, have a worse life than you do, right? If they look, angry and shitty and miserable, then they're worse off than you are. One of my favorite Socratic lines is, "'Tis better to suffer injustice than to cause it," right? A person who is, I would say, has bad moral luck, right, is a bad person because of bad luck, because that's the only reason anyone is anything, has a worse life than you do. You may not feel that when they're causing you harm, but it's true. Right? At the end of the day, Donald Trump has a worse life than you do. It's got to be horrible being inside of his head. So, as hard as it is, I think what you want to do, the kind of Buddhist meditative practice you can do, is cultivate compassion towards everybody, even people who really, really, really seem like they deserve to suffer. And this is where mindfulness work comes in. A lot of the luck pilling stuff is mindfulness, and a lot of mindfulness is luck pilling. It goes way, way back into these traditions. One Buddhist meditation, for example. How many of you have seen Everything Everywhere All at Once? One of my favorite movies of all time about luck. Watch it again. There's so much luck symbolism in there. The part where you see all the different multiverses. This is actually a Buddhist meditation, where you sit and you meditate and you practice putting yourself in every different possible scenario as every different person And it reminds you that they would say, on a long enough reincarnation timeline, you literally are every person in every arrangement in every situation, but more metaphorically, there but for the grace of luck, you're the abuser instead of the abused. All it takes is you being the one who experienced the cycles of abuse, and you're in that position instead. And that can help generate both humility for our own successes and compassion for other people's failures, moral and otherwise. Now, I'm not telling you if someone has just done something really horrible to you, you immediately need to forgive them or something. That's not the same thing here at all. It's one thing to be compassionate towards someone, and it's another thing to forgive them. Forgiveness, in theory, involves them recognizing they've done something wrong, potentially. That's a huge debate in philosophy of forgiveness. Philosopher's the worst. But, you don't have to spend all your time around a person who's abusive, but at a distance, you can recognize that they are abusive because they have very bad luck, and be compassionate towards them at a distance. All right? Critical social justice. All right? Y'all maybe have heard that phrase thrown around a lot. That is this technical term for wokeness. Critical social justice is a lot of these views applied to law and economics and politics, and it's about helping us recognize, the degree to which everything is just reproduced luck all the way down. And that's why you will see critical social justice folks getting in trouble for problematizing meritocracy. Now, unfortunately, I don't think any of them have the right argument for undermining it yet. That's why I'm trying to give them this one. Because if you don't, the ethical argument for meritocracy is very strong on its face. It's very compelling. People think that it makes a lot of sense. So you've got to have something really strong to push back against it, or you're never going to fully read it out. They're just going to think that what we need is a better meritocracy. And restructuring our life. So quality of life isn't tied to merit, right? That people ask me, what's the thing you want instead? I want a luckocracy, right? I want a world where we recognize that everything is luck, and that no one should have bad quality of life because of their luck. And most of you believe versions of this. This is the argument behind the social safety net. When you look at basic progressive agendas like, welfare and socialized medicine, what you're basically saying is you want to allocate risk so that if someone suffers very bad luck, that suffering is distributed. Because it is actually better if all of us have one tiny little bit of pain rather than one person has an overwhelming amount of pain. Okay, so if we can convince ourselves that the person who is poor doesn't deserve to be poor, we can help them and thereby improve everyone's quality of life. Now finally, are we ever allowed to feel satisfied that we've made progress or gotten there? I think yes. And this is not, this is still a part of my dissertation that I'm working out, but I don't think we want to take the view that literally society never improves or progresses, right? A lot of people used to think that slavery was okay. Now a lot fewer do. That's progress, right? It's not well evenly distributed progress, but it is progress. Progress can be made. So what I would say here is yes, we can, but with humility and many, many grains of salt. We have to acknowledge that it's always easy to slip into thinking things are way fairer than they actually are. And so when you make improvements, you have to acknowledge there's still a lot of work to be done. And that makes motivation harder, but I think it prevents us from letting ourselves off the hook too early. So I'll leave it there and happily take questions. And thank you all very much for listening.
How close are you to defending?
I am going to defend in, hopefully, spring of 2025. Okay. So I've got the proposal approved. I am maybe a little less than halfway done writing it.
Okay.
And then the hope is it turns into a book. Magically.
My question was going to be, so as far as retribution, what effect does that have? Can we actually tell enough to get feel better? Is there?
Yeah, retribution's got to go.
Aaron, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question I think was, is retribution, what is the impact of retribution?
What would the impact of retribution on, just world theory? Do people feel they can actually get retribution enough, can you tell enough to get back to
Well, there's definitely a correlation between desire for retributive punishment and just world belief. And again, I imagine it's similar to the correlation with the free will stuff, where you have a strong desire to see someone punished, and then belief in free will, belief in just world makes it seem more justified than it might actually be. But yeah, in my view, there's no acceptable forms of retribution. It's never okay. Nobody deserves. When I give my life killing talk, sometimes I give an alternative title. Nobody deserves to suffer, not even Hitler. Because if you really want to do this kind of meditative work, you have to acknowledge it's true for literally everybody, including Alex Jones or pick your favorite worst person, play the game at home. Because again, if you believe that everybody has luck all the way down, then it's true for them too. And while they did very terrible things, that doesn't mean they deserve to suffer. And sometimes people who are non-religious can get there by reminding themselves you don't think that anyone should suffer for all eternity in hell, and then slowly work your way back from there. But we don't need retributive justice at all. We have perfectly good alternatives that produce much better results. So yeah, it's about weeding out. So humans are an evolved mixed bag when it comes to moral psychology. It's great that you all have a hardwired sense of fairness. It sucks how much you want to punish people. And they kind of go hand in hand a bit. So you got to tease them apart some and say, it's okay to care about fairness, shift to a needs base, and stop trying to hurt people.
So the bullet point I struggle with the most is the very last one, the idea that there is a point where we can say that we've done enough. I know for myself, if I walk past someone that's experiencing homelessness, it's easy for me to say that I understand that person doesn't deserve that. But I think what goes along with that is I don't deserve my comfortable life. And I don't know how I ever become okay living in comfort when other people are living in discomfort.
Yeah, I wouldn't say have we done enough. I would say have we helped? Have we improved things at all? So I think it's okay to say that thing I did actually helped improve that person's quality of life, as long as you don't then make the jump to kind of what we call moral licensing, where it's like, well, now I don't have to give a shit anymore, right? You don't get to stop caring. Ethics is a lifelong activity. You never get there. But I do think that we have to acknowledge when we have helped someone, because psychologically there are limits on what I can ask of y'all, and I'm already asking way too much. And if you never get any positive reinforcement for your behavior, you will break at some point. So I think it's okay to have positive reinforcement. You want to localize it to the person, like the fact that you helped the person, right? Instead of, I'm awesome because I did that, it feels really good that person is suffering less, and I can enjoy that pleasure a little bit, but not let it keep me from helping the next person. I think there's nothing else.
So I have a bit of a hypothetical situation that I'm curious if you might think about. So there's three people. One of them has a knife kind of in their hand. One of them, they see the person with the knife in their hand, and then there's another person that was actually there when the knife went into the person's hand. From your talk, it seems like the person that just sees that, it would be wrong of them to victim blame in this instance.
Okay.
But this other person that was there when it actually happened saw the guy maybe he's twirling the knife, and it lodges in his hand.
Right.
I would assume that, well, you did it to yourself. I mean, it's victim blame. I was there. I saw you doing this thing, and I knew that it was going to eventually end up with you getting your hand and stuff.
Right.
Is there a difference between those two perspectives?
There shouldn't be.
There should be.
So the reason would be, take the hypothetical one step further, right? Why is the person throwing the knife up and over again like that? Is it because they were raised to be careless? Is it because they have a mental illness? Is it because they are on drugs? Whatever the reason is, you're going to still want to trace things back, and you're going to want to acknowledge that it's going to come down to luck far enough back if you go back that way. So the only difference between those two individuals is knowing what caused the problem and maybe how to fix it, right? The person who saw that happen is going to know this person needs,
They might say, like, hey, stop throwing the knife.
Right. You're going to want to correct the behavior, but it doesn't. So victim blaming would be, it's good that the person has the knife in their hand because they deserve it, in a sense, or it's right or just. But it's never right or just for someone to suffer. It's just bad luck.
Yeah, I guess it's the logical thing of like, if you twirl the knife, then the chances of you getting stuck in your hand are higher. But I guess that's not necessarily victim blaming.
Well, yeah, so it's understanding the cause, but not necessarily blaming the victim. It's only if you're like, well, you're an idiot for doing that, and so I'm not going to help you, right? Or I don't care, or something. Yeah, so I don't think there's a fundamental difference there in how we should treat those individuals beyond how we try to correct the behavior.
Idiots deserve care too.
And like, think about it, you said, it's logic, right? Logic is not common to everybody. Some people have the very bad luck of being taught not logic, and will end up doing bad behavior. Or, if not taught it, some people don't have impulse control, not for reasons under their control, obviously. Right? If you're raised in a house with lead paint and abused growing up, you will engage in a lot more risky, impulsive, self-destructive behavior, including flipping a knife. See if anybody else has it. Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of restate from the main themes of your presentation, you would argue that being luck-filled and by extension dissolving this just work belief is a logical next step from dissolving the libertarian free will idea. So if you dissolve the idea of libertarian free will, what logically follows is being luck-filled in a sense and dissolving the just work belief.
Yes, so I would technically put it, luck pilling is what helps you dissolve the libertarian free will belief, or the illusion of free will, as well as the illusion of the just world, because they're connected.
Well, but the directionality of that process is, well, if you can sort of disbelieve libertarian free will, and then you resonate more with that idea of luck-filling.
Well, so I would put it more, the more you make people aware of luck, the harder it is for them to continue to believe in the libertarian free will. Though also I should point out, my view attacks compatibilist free will the exact same. So compatibilism is just a denial of the problem of luck, and so you just press the problem of constitutive luck on them, and they have to acknowledge that it's luck as well, and try to bite the bullet and still say that you somehow deserve to suffer because of it.
Could you unpack compatibilism?
Sure, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So there are two kinds of people who try to believe in free will. There are the ones who believe in the libertarian, independent self, souls, Atman sitting inside of you, at controls kind of thing. And then there are compatibilists like Dennett who will reduce the concept of free will down to something we do have, but I don't think is actually what we mean when we say free will. So what they'll reduce it down to is something called capacitarian accounts. So literally just your capacity to do something, whether that's make a choice or think slowly, or you have the right kind of ethical background so that you are reflexively responsive to a situation and act ethically in that situation, for example. All those kinds of capacities. Problem is, whether you have those capacities or not, 100% luck, right? And they don't have a response to that. And I can promise you I've read them all. They will, in many ways, like Dennett's answer is absolutely the worst. He's like, yeah, there's no answer, but we should just pretend. We'll split them in half. Maybe we won't get it perfect, but it's good enough. But the reason this is bad is because, again, the desire to punish is the driving force behind belief in free will. And if you preserve this compatibilist account of free will, you're gonna hang on to that desire to punish in a way that is harmful.
So, our culture tends to think of forgiveness, forbearance, and empathy as soft skills. But they are actually very difficult skills of a common sense approach to connection and community and peace. How do we change the orientation of our culture?
Social emotional learning. Like another big factor, in the educational world that does help with this stuff is social emotional learning, which involves things like viewpoint taking, right? So when someone does something and hurts somebody else, instead of just hurting them back and punishing them, we help them think about what it might have felt like for that person and try to put themselves in that person's perspective These are muscles that you can just build up. We're just not good at teaching people to build them up as a culture. But we are, Aristotle says we are good by nature and made good by habits. Which is to say, I think we have innate features of us that make us predisposed to develop certain kinds of virtues if we are put in the right environment and treated in the right kinds of ways. I firmly believe that the vast majority of humans who are not in some way damaged will grow up to be functionally ethical individuals because if they are put in the right kinds of environments that positively reinforce that kind of behavior. So I think it's very doable, and I think we've seen progress on it. I think the expansion of the moral community over the past 100 years or so is partly the result of people acknowledging more and more suffering that is unnecessary and trying to help with it more and more. So the animal rights movement is very thoroughly predicated on just making people more aware of the suffering of animals. Yeah.
With the example you gave, kind of seeing somebody in traffic, and as far as like how that relates to being love-filled, if we were to push kind of being love-filled on everybody, what would you say, or I guess what would you recommend to people from tricking themselves into thinking they're always kind of at the bottom of the pool? Because it seems like people tend to,
Sure.
especially people that have lived kind of one life straight through without having switched a lot of like to the environments around them. It seems like it's just hard to get that perspective unless you lived inside of a bunch of different lives like that. So how would you recommend people stay away from that mindset of like lowering over time in the pool to where you are the one that's unlucky in the situation?
You are the one that's responsible still, you mean, at the bottom level or something?
Kind of, yeah. I guess just like if you have like a pool of like the luckiest versus the unlucky. Like how do people stop themselves from slipping down in that mindset as more kind of bad things randomly happen to them?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So I think what you're asking is, on my view, if somebody experiences injustice, how do they not free fall into depression or something like that because they don't have these coping mechanisms?
Yeah, it's like how do you stop sliding down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, and this is where I get anxious because I really do worry sometimes that my position is a little bit of a privileged position, one that is at least easier to take when you are in a privileged state. And then I often think back to my friend Brittany Page, who I like to appeal to in this as my Heraclitus, I guess, or not, it's a terrible reference. Brittany Page was raised by Nazis. Literal, actual Aryan nation, not people on the internet, real genuine kind of Nazis, like Kids Fight Club Nazis. She escaped. Her siblings did not. When you ask her about it, she doesn't talk about her ethical bootstraps or something. She talks about, that she was lucky enough to have a teacher who helped her climb out of that space because she was a cute blonde girl and not a scary skinhead boy. So I do think even people who come from places of severe not privilege can still get to this kind of luck-pilled position. And I think even if you've experienced a lot of suffering, so I've had a rough year, I'll tell you, quite honestly. I've had a lot of shit to deal with this year. And I think, and like before that, I had 10 years of dealing with the results of the treatment of my partner who was very, very, very sick. And before that, it was dealing with them being very, 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 very sick. And in all of those instances, telling myself that it was luck helped. So it helped me be less resentful to being a primary caregiver because it wasn't her fault, right? It's just luck. It helped me this year to not completely lose my mind as all these things were happening because I could acknowledge that it wasn't because I was a bad person who deserved these things. It was bad luck. That doesn't mean that we have to always let ourselves off the hook, right? An increase in humility and compassion towards ourselves as well is important. But if you're doing something wrong, you still want to acknowledge that you're doing something wrong and try to correct for it. But I do think we can become more clear-eyed about that when it's not attached to all these other things, right? When the conclusion that I made a mistake doesn't mean that I deserve to suffer. It just means I have to correct that mistake. It's easier to actually acknowledge and correct the mistake. That's the whole idea in restorative justice. So I do think that there is no perfect solution to living in an unjust world, right? Sometimes people ask me, how does luck pilling help the single mom who's barely surviving right now? And the answer is, it only does a little bit, because nothing is going to faster. right? There's no radical solution to radical wealth inequality that will fix it in 10 years. So what you have to do is give people the tools to fix it multi-generationally. But I do think that individual in that moment, if she buys into this kind of mindfulness, luck-filling stuff, won't be as resentful towards her kids, won't be, holding on to as much anger and stuff over the course of the day. We don't want that to prevent us from actually working towards more social justice, though. But again, I think paradoxically, being just angry doesn't actually lead to better behavior in those fronts. Understanding things, I think, can actually help give you that real sense of control. But it's not perfect, there's still gonna be depression.
So I think that from my own personal experience, it seems like it's more easy for people who are not happy or have not felt that they were lucky or that they got everything that they deserved in a good way, to accept that kind of thing. For people who are, you mentioned Bill Gates and Elon, and they kind of feel like they deserve their billions. How do we get through to people who think I'm in a great spot because I deserve to be in a great spot?
Yeah.
A hard challenge.
I am in the process of luck filling some billionaires. I'll tell you how it goes. For this one. You quote Bill Gates too, right? You point out that Bill Gates is richer than them, doesn't believe that nonsense, that Warren Buffett doesn't believe that nonsense. It's hard. And this again goes back to the Buddhists, right? The Buddhists believe that only a human could have become the Buddha. It couldn't have been, demon in hell because there's too much suffering for them to learn to escape it. And it couldn't have been a god either, because a god experiences no suffering and so would never see any reason to escape samsara, right? So the mix of suffering and not is probably the sweet spot for being able to hit this point. But that doesn't mean you can't bring everyone else along with you. And in a sense, the Bodhisattva path is luck-pilling the entire universe and never stopping until you do. It's harder, but I've talked to a lot, for example, Silicon Valley billionaires are way easier on this front because they pretty well know how lucky they are because they just suddenly had a giant pile of money where they didn't before, right? It might be harder for people who are in some ways bred into intergenerational wealth and might still believe in kind of the nobility or something. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's not actually, there's a lot of resistance to these ideas, but it's not actually hard to convince someone that these things are true. The hard part is for them themselves to work on internalizing it. The argument's pretty fast.
What strikes me listening to you talk about how to turn off the just world delusion is there's so much suffering in trying to tangle with the feeling of it's not fair, whether it's to me or somebody else, but particularly to me, so much mental energy gets burned up trying to twist the why did this happen, it's not fair, what did I do, what did they do? So much of that, if you can do the mindful work, so much of that can be let go of, leaving you free to say, what do I do now? How do I deal with this? How do I cope with this?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're not tangling with the who's to blame for this undeserved injustice.
Right. And again, I agree and don't want to jettison the idea of fairness entirely alongside just desserts and things. But we want to get rid of the dessert-based account of fairness and replace it with a needs-based account where instead of, in restorative justice, the main questions are what happened and what harm was caused, what needs arise as a result of that, and what needs have to be met for this not to happen again, right? And that doesn't involve any of the psychodrama of figuring out who's really the bad person in the situation. Sometimes it's going to be clear, and when I say bad person, I still think there are quote-unquote bad people, by which I mean people who have the bad moral luck of being disposed to do bad things, people who have been habituated to be bad people in this kind of way. It's not their fault, they don't deserve to suffer, but we should acknowledge that it's sort of wishful thinking to look at someone who consistently does bad behavior and expect them to suddenly stop because we've changed our perspective. Yeah.
Before
are all great questions, by the way. I really appreciate it. If I don't sound that way.
Speak reminds me of something Friedrich Nietzsche said, that "Amor fati, love your fate." I don't know if deserving or earning something really matters. I think, you know, you have the fate you have the life you have, be grateful for what you have. Want less, be more grateful.
Yeah, the Buddhists have more, want less. So I'm not a huge fan of the word fate, just because tends to be associated with the superstitious kinds of luck. Though I don't think in his case he meant that. But yeah,
Destiny.
yeah, the term that I like for this would be, the Tao abides. So in Taoism, the idea is acceptance, non-action through acceptance of what is. We don't literally grasp after control to change all of this, and thereby paradoxically are actually better able to change things. But I would say, so the one thing you have to be careful on those views is, again, you don't take it to the point of thinking that you shouldn't try to improve the world. You don't end up back at a place of status quo. I worry about this with neo-stoicism too. Everybody's like, be a stoic now, change your inner mental states, don't worry as much about changing the world. And I think that actually does pretty heavily undermine a lot of the critical social justice work, and it's why some of the folks who promote the neo-stoicism end up in the kind of heterodox anti-woke camp, because they think that the answer to, all of this fragility in the world is anti-fragility training. And that's not bad, but if that's your only focus, if you're not changing the world too, it's a huge problem. So this is a view that does help you psychologically, but the helping you psychologically should be on the road to helping you luck pill the rest of the world and change society on a grand scale. And so like what I would say is, if you're lucky, your fate is going to be that, and you're going to help people, and that's what we would hope for. And if you're not, then we're going to try to help you get on that track if we can.
So does this come from like a purely deterministic world, and then the justification is like a moral imperative to reduce suffering? Or those like that what underpins this whole thought?
Sort of. So one way to talk about free will denial is to talk about determinism. I do not tend to want to talk about determinism and indeterminism because I've already thrown way too many concepts at you at this point in any conversation, and it's going to leave you thinking that you need to understand physics to believe me here, and you don't. I promise. All right? This isn't, it's about determinism in the sense that you are caused by prior things, but we don't need to know for sure that we live in a fully deterministic versus indeterministic universe. So if you're worried about quantum indeterminacy, don't be. Because, and this is what's called the hard free will, or the hard no free will, or the hard luck view. It's bad either way, right? If it's fully deterministic, which is to say, if you are the result of a necessary set of events, of causes going all the way back to the Big Bang, then you clearly don't have free will. That's a classic argument. But also, if it's indeterminate, right, if somewhere in the cells of your brain there's some quantum particle that randomly flips one way or the other, we don't want to call that free will either, because that's just random chance. What you want when you say you have free will is really what the libertarians say they want, which is that unmoved mover inside of you that you can feel good about being you because it did the right thing. So yeah, I stay away from determinism, indeterminism unless asked directly about it, because really this is a problem of psychology. It's like, the regress that I like to always give people is pick any action in your mind where you still have the lingering doubt that you didn't lack free will in that moment, and ask yourself why you did that action. What was the reason? And if you're lucky enough to be able to figure out what the reason is, ask yourself, what about your nature, your constitution, led you to choose that reason over the other? Why did that reason win out when there's a bunch of competing reasons? And then we can ask, did you choose to have that kind of constitution, to be the person who stays up and works hard versus the one who screws around and plays games, right? And if you say yes, implausibly, then we can just repeat the regress. Why did you choose that? What was your reason? Oh, well, I really care about succeeding. Okay, why did you choose that? What was your reason? Well, I was raised that way. Right? And so you go far enough back, we're always going to find a cause that is beyond your control. it is a kind of deterministic argument, but without ever having to discuss the nature of particles or the universe. We simply just have to point out that, like, it is implausible that any of us are self-generated in this kind of way.
Fair enough. The second part would be,
Mm-hmm.
is this dealing with the imperative that the goal of this philosophy would be to reduce suffering? It seems to be like the end goal, like what this will all end.
Yeah, so I would say you have to add in moral views to get from this to that. But like those views are objectively true and you should believe them. So it is objectively true that all things being equal, you ought to reduce suffering. And if you're lucky enough to know that and understand it and be habituated to do so, then yes, this view will increase your desire to do that kind of thing. You just have to have those moral truths habituated as well. Right? And none of this undermines those moral truths. Hopefully that's clear. It's very easy for your moral judgments of whether someone did something wrong, whether they deserve to suffer, to come apart. Just think of the many, many cases of a small child. I have a slide that's a tweet that's like, a 6-year-old shot their teacher, and now the police are trying to figure out how to charge a child. And I'm like, that's fucking terrible. Not just because it's a tragedy, but because they think that they can in some way rationalize punishing a 6-year-old for doing something they don't comprehend. And then you just scale that up to everybody.
So I wonder if you, I really wanted to just know if you agree with this thing about this day. So I thought about evil and trying to understand that. And for me, what evil is, what society deems evil. And I'm thinking of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Okay.
Because when he was captured, allegedly he said, for what I've done, I should be killed. So like he knows what he's doing is wrong, but he does it anyway.
Maybe.
If anybody's evil, it seems like he might be one. But to me, it seems that evil is just a deficiency in nature and nurture. Someone's genetically predisposed to be a certain way and then not help any way whatsoever, with how they were raised, or actively harm them in such a way that made them commit atrocities later. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah. So for folks who can't hear, this statement is essentially anytime you think of somebody being evil, what you're just saying is they have some mix of bad, constitutive, and circumstantial luck. Right? And nowadays, I think psychology has moved a little bit away from the hardline nature versus nurture into epigenetics, and like it's all a blend of nature and nurture. Doesn't change the argument one bit. It's still whatever mix of genetics and environment created you. Yeah. And we don't know that Dahmer actually knew that or not. Interestingly, cannibalism is one of the most used things for demonizing individuals. So the flip side of victim blaming is demonizing of bad people who do bad things, but also demonizing of people who we want to cause harm to. So colonialism popularized hatred of cannibalism as a way to attack indigenous people. This is the most used mechanism for demonizing of indigenous people, such that the first map of America has a cannibal on it. So it's interesting that you reached for Dahmer, because that is something you have been habituated to think about as the worst kind of evil by a colonialist society. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case specifically for Dahmer specifically, but I just learned about him watching that Netflix.
Oh, I mean, I'm not saying it's the only reason. I'm saying the reason that everyone's obsessed with someone like Dahmer more than John Wayne Gacy, for example, I think is partly because he eats people. And because we've been trained really, really hard to think about that as the worst thing that people can do, or like sign a truly unrepentantly evil individual. And we're running out of time, aren't we?
CEOs and politicians that have much higher body counts.
Right. But again, remember, all this should lead away from eat the rich, right? As sympathetic as I am to that desire, the rich will just be replaced by other rich. That doesn't change anything, and they don't deserve to suffer even if they're rich.
Yeah, I'm going to step
We're
in
done.
and wrap you.
Yep. Thank y'all.
So I want to thank Aaron for coming down and doing the presentation. Thank all of you for being here. Especially thank Mark for running home and getting us a cord for the microphone when he realized we didn't have one. Thank you, Mark. Please, if you listen to podcasts, check out Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. They're amazing. If you read, check out The Skeptic. Okay. So thanks, everyone. We're going over to the Durham Food Hall after we clear up and put everything away. So please join us for Durham Food Hall food. Thank you.